All right, so next up, we have some budget and audit committee items. The first thing that we're going to take up is looking at the second draft of next year's budget. So last meeting, we had a pretty long and robust conversation about what our collective goals were and directives. And so we're bringing back the second draft. And there will be the final budget will come forward at the next meeting in September, which is in just a few weeks. So we need to give some clear directives if there are any, so that we can turn this around. And then we'll also have our first discussion about setting the 2025 license fees. And that will also come back in September for action. So I am going to turn it over to our finance director, Tiffany Lynch.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So we're starting with the fiscal 2024 budget draft 2, which is on page 273 of the materials. As Executive Director Nevitt noted, that the first draft was brought forward to the board at the June meeting, and we went through a number of topics of conversation to help us develop the second draft. If you recall, it was discussion around the use of reserves, budget approach to items that have kind of an unknown fiscal impact, staffing philosophy, future funding for facilities, and then also the possibility of seeing a version of the budget with some assumptions built in for lease negotiations. So we took all of that feedback into account and have provided you with a second draft. In addition to the General Fund, CLE, and Client Protection Fund, we are also including Sections Fund and the capital budget. So those are the two new items. So the memo does provide a lot of detail about the changes between the drafts, but we'll go through high level by fund, the key differences, and then discuss a little bit more about projections and then move into the license fees. So starting off with the general fund, this fund is really the bulk of our operations. It is most of the cost centers are included in this fund. It is primarily funded through license fees. The second draft reflects a use of reserves of about $986,000, which is a decrease from the prior version of the budget of $122,000. And that is a result of increases in revenue as well as increases in expenses. For revenues, we increased the budget by $200,000 for interest income, and that's because we looked at the various investments that we have. We were able to roll forward a lot of them and lock in current interest rates, which have been much higher. And so we have a good number of investments that won't be maturing until next fiscal year. With that information, we feel confident to increase the budget for that line item. In terms of expenses, it's a combination of both indirect and direct expenses. For the indirect expenses, we'll go through these changes more in detail in the next couple of slides, but high level, indirect expenses is additional staffing costs as well as direct expenses for specific programmatic needs.
Yeah, I have just a question on this page.
Mm-hmm.
So since it looks like your reserves are higher from the first draft to the second draft, I didn't understand the parenthetical difference that would seem to show it would be lower. Should those parentheses not be there? And it's actually
yes, in the very bottom line. Correct.
Greater. Okay.
Yes, thank you. It is negative in the change in net income, but positive in the projected reserves. Thank you, Governor Stevens. Okay. In the indirect expenses, so this is the bulk of our expenses, staffing costs and overhead, really things like rent and insurance. The main changes here for the general fund salaries is an net increase of $21,511. That's a combination of additions and subtractions. So the additions are 3 full-time FTE positions. The first is an event specialist that would create capacity to support event planning for the Board of Governors and the Executive Director. As we've moved towards events that are further outside and away from WSBA's headquarters, that need has been created, and so this position would serve that function. The second position is the diversity, equity, and inclusion staff. That position would be able to create capacity to conduct the equity analyses for all proposed board action items, train entities to have a equity lens in their work, and also create and develop resources for members and future members. And then the third is an analyst for the mandatory continuing legal education group. So that group has seen an influx in volume in their work, and they typically hire temporary staff in order to support them through busy seasons. But as a result of increased workload, the reality is that we've seen more of a need for a full-time staff person as opposed to that seasonal temp. So the one difference with this position is that by adding it, we are reducing our temporary staff cost in exchange for it. We did reduce salaries in two different areas. I just mentioned the temporary staff, so exchanging a full-time staff person for temporary staffing. But in addition to that exchange, we also are approaching our temporary staffing with a different approach. So normally we use agency temp staffing, and we're going to be using a direct hire, which tends to be lower cost. So that's our approach for additional cost savings in fiscal year 24. We also have a pool of funds that are geared towards providing support for mid-year market adjustments and a potential performance incentive plan. And that particular budget has been reduced as well. So all in all, for salaries, a net increase for the general fund of just over $21,000. For payroll taxes and benefits, we see a decrease of, yes, I'm sorry.
Sorry, yeah, I was trying to ask a question on that because there are a lot of numbers and I understand like moving to actual employees versus contractors. My broader question looking at this though, with an increase of just $21,000, that doesn't look like even one full-time employee. So I guess my general question on this is, does this give the state bar the number of employees necessary to have slack to do things if something comes up, or is it maintaining the ability to function as we currently are?
I think it's a combination.
Okay.
In those, I think there's ones that we're absolutely maintaining and others that are giving a little more capacity that we didn't have before.
And I would just add, this didn't meet all of the requests we had. And I think, but it reflects the sense we got from the board at the last meeting that the majority of folks folks were all over the place. The sense we got is most folks would like to see a modest investment in staffing that we need, not necessarily sort of the full wish list. So we took some time to go back over the requests and identify what we felt was most critical, and that's what this reflects.
Payroll benefits, payroll taxes and benefits, those increase for the additional staff, but we also had a decrease in the retirement costs, and that's because the rate for our employer contribution was announced back in June and went down by 1. And so that had a significant savings, I think almost $120,000. And so the net between those items is $66,000 decrease in the budget. And then lastly, other indirect expenses, we have an increase of $51,000, combination of a couple things. The big item here is an addition of $100,000 for cloud infrastructure. This was identified as a need in the first draft of the budget, but had not been included. This is to move from on-premises network infrastructure to cloud-based. And so that was identified as something that really needed to happen in fiscal year 24. We also reduced some costs for legal fees and depreciation based on historical spending and then expectations for next year's work as well. So all in all, the changes for the indirect budget in the general fund, I think nets out to about $6,700 increase. And so not a huge change from draft to draft. I did want to note that we, as executive director mentioned, we are working on the final draft of the budget like right now. And there are two items that have been updated. So I wanted to just give you a heads up that they will be included in the final draft. The first is that we have completed our insurance renewal process. And the great news there is that the premium that we have for fiscal 24 is actually very similar to the one for 23. So the budget has an increase included in it right now, and we'll be able to eliminate that from the next draft. I think it's about $22,000 change. The other is that after the Department of Retirement Systems announced their rate reduction, they then also came back and said effective September 1st, there would be an increase in the administrative fee for retirement. So they're increasing it effective September 1st by 0.14%. So not a huge difference, equates to about $19,000. And so that number will go up. So between those two, we're coming out ahead a little bit, but I wanted to make sure you knew that those would be included in the next draft. Are there any questions about the indirect expense changes from this draft to the first draft before I move on? Nope. Okay. Direct expense increases, a total of 71,000 for the general fund. It's a combination of additions of new line items and increases to existing line items. And then we always go through every draft and look to make sure that we are paying attention to historical spending, to current spending and planning, and if there's any adjustments that need to be made. So there's some objections in the budget as well for that work. To start off with, we added $55,000 for the Small Town and Rural Committee outreach and activities. That's a new line item for next fiscal year. The $55,000 comprised of three main areas. One is additional spending or funds for the job fairs and outreach activities. There's also a stakeholder summit and then the development of a pipeline program. So that's what the $55,000 includes. The second is an increase to an existing cost for the Moderate Means program. That's a program that's held at all three law schools that we fund. They typically come to us asking for an annual increase, tying to their staffing that they're funding, increase in their costs. So that's pretty typical for them to come forward and ask for an increase. So that currently that's $14,000. We are also adding $10,000 to the budget for a DEI Council pipeline to the Profession Summit. That is a new line item. In the last version of the budget, we had identified this as a request. I think the amount was higher. It was about $50,000, but after going back and talking with the team about what the summit would need, I think we identified that the cost was lower. So we've included $10,000 for that summit to occur in fiscal 24. Increase for chief hearing officer. So we have a contract with the chief hearing officer. That contract amount has not changed since 2011. And so 12 years since the initial value was associated to the contract. Over time, obviously, inflation costs have risen. And so the request to increase by $10,000 is included. There is a link in the materials to the specific duties of the chief hearing officer if you want to understand more about what that position does. Also included is an increased examiner fees. This is for the bar exam. There are 2 bar exams a year, and we have folks that grade the exams, and this is the stipend they receive to grade the exam. Similar to the chief hearing officer, the increase the fee itself has not changed in quite some time. The last time it changed was in 2013, so 10 years ago. And that was when we shifted to the existing format of the bar exam. In the previous version was the essay version. So again, with rising costs and need to support through stipend, the request has been included into the budget. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Director Lynch is the person who made the request for the chief hearing officer, and it really was only because of the fact that I'd had other related conversations with general counsel. Is there a way that you and your team can have this on so that the people who are doing these jobs don't need to go 11, 12 years before there's adjustments in the future? I mean, I'm not saying they need to be part of annual, but I really, again, knowing what the chief hearing officer does for their work and how much goes into that, I feel like it's a real shame that the prior governors in the last 11 years didn't think to say, hey, maybe we should increase $500 or whatever. So is there for these positions that aren't staff, is there a way that there could just be like a tickler that we look at if there should be smaller adjustments more regularly?
Yeah, so one of the things that these 2 specific requests has highlighted for us is the need to look across the entire organization at all different groups that may receive a stipend or a contract or value and create consistency, like you mentioned, right? How often are we looking at it? What are the values? Are they consistent? What's the work that they do? Is it equitable? Like there's a lot that needs to kind of be unpacked there. And so that is, in my mind, something that I'd like to see us work on a plan for next year and next fiscal year to really just identify exactly what you're saying is going 10 years and making these big jumps, probably not the best, but we also want to tie it to something that is meaningful, right? Like if it's, not if this is that, the contract amount is not meant to be a substitute for pay, right? So again, making sure that we understand why the person is getting some form of payment and if that is consistent with what others are doing across the organization. So yeah. Okay, so the last three items are reductions in the direct expenses. Custodianships is because we looked at the actual expenditures over time and then what we expect for next year. So reduced that. And character and fitness board is basically tied to the number of hearings that we expect to have. And so with that, we looked back at expectations for next year, and the number of hearings is likely to be lower than originally planned. And then lastly, depreciation expense for mandatory continuing education. And that is because the project for the software itself has been pushed out. So depreciation expense won't begin depreciation until later in the year. Are there any further questions about the direct expenses? Okay. Speaking of the items, so we brought forward a lot of items in the first draft and identified all the needs. Here are some things that we did not include in this draft. One is there was a couple of staffing positions that we did not include. One is a network operations manager in our technology department, and that was actually just resolved through reallocating some of our existing resources. And so we are hiring for a network operations manager, but just decided to restructure some of the positions that we have in order to support that. Public outreach and education specialist, that position's on hold at this point. We really need to spend a little more time developing a clearer vision for our public engagement. And so with more time invested there, we'll be able to determine what that position looks like. And then additional investment in staff professional development and training. I want to just make sure you all know that this was additional funds, not that there are no funds in the budget for staff development and training. So there's existing funds matching similar to the funding level of fiscal 2023. And so a lot of our staff go to conferences and trainings to support their development. We did increase the budget by about 4% compared to fiscal 23 to support rising costs for airfare and hotel and meals and things of that nature. And then document scanning. This was a request to be able to take all of our paper records and make them electronic. We've got lots on our premises as well as off-site. And this project would have really sped it up and made it happen within four to 6 months. And this is not identified as a priority for this year. If for some reason we're able to, sublease our space or need to downsize and consolidate quickly, then that might be something that we need to do. But at this point in time, we've chosen not to make that a priority. The CLE budget and the client protection fund budget, there are no substantive changes there. The only impact is the reduction in retirement costs and the overhead type expenses like the depreciation and cloud infrastructure. So the only thing you'll see there is, changes in their net income or loss due to reduction in expenses. So for a CLE fund, they're still looking at a net income of $149,000 for 3 cost centers. And the client protection fund just has a little bit less of a spend down in their reserves at $93,000 for 2024's second draft. The 2 new items are the section budgets and the capital budget. Now the section funds we're not comparing to the first draft, but comparing to fiscal 2023, have a anticipated spend down of reserves of almost $57,000. It's very similar to 2023. But we do have at least one section that had not submitted their budget at the time when we prepared this draft. And so that number will change depending upon how their budget looks. But they've already submitted it, and so it'll be included in the final draft that you see in September. One thing to note is section membership is like the primary revenue source for sections. And once every year we ask sections if they want to make any changes to their dues. And this year, the section membership dues is being requested to change for the World Peace Through Law section to reduce it from $30 to $25. So the board will need to take action on that request along with the budget at the next meeting. The capital budget's the last piece here. Now, the capital items total $340,000. It's in attachment F in the materials, and it equates to about $57,000 in depreciation. A reminder that a capital item for WSBIS purposes is anything that has a $2,500 value, and at least over 1 year of useful life. Did you have a question, Governor-elect Bloom, or do you want me to move through this first? Okay. So keep in mind, I just want to note that the depreciation was included in the first draft. It's not an additional amount of depreciation, but most of these items are pretty routine. The biggest line item here is capital labor, and that's really our IT staff that produces software development on particular programming, software projects that we use within the WISBA. And so software purchases, hardware purchases, and then some minimal leasehold improvements for our physical space related to an accessibility study and any recommendations that come out of that. Okay. Do you have a question that I can answer? Yeah. Well, sure.
Yeah, the question was with regards to the section budgets and the section dues. I notice frequently when there are CLEs, they'll have non-section CLE price, and then they'll have section CLE price, and they'll have if you want to become a section member. How does that allocation occur with regards to, does it reduce the CLE revenue? Is the budget, or is the section dues then incremented by is that full amount of the dues that they have to pay for the section?
So it does depend, and I see Director Platchy's hand up, and I think he's probably best to answer this. So I might just defer to you first and then add anything else.
Yeah, Governor Bloom, I think I can answer your question. If there's a section discount offered for a CLE, that's just part of the pricing. It doesn't actually come out of the section fund. It affects the income to the revenue of the program that's being offered. So ultimately, it could affect the section split because CLE and the section split the revenue, but it's not coming directly out of the section fund. It's just all part of this seminar cost.
Okay. All right. All right. So fiscal projections. We'll move on. So with the second draft of the budget, you see that we have included this is for the general fund, the use of reserves of $985,000, and then the column for unrestricted reserves. Remember that that is the one pot of money that is available to support spending that exceeds revenue. We have other reserves that are designated by the board, like the the operating reserve and the facilities reserve, separate of what's listed here in unrestricted. So we've included the updated budget, but we've also included the fiscal 23 projection. So that's new. We've gone through, we are now at the end of July. We're closing July right now, but we made it through 75% of the year. We're doing a lot of projections, and we believe we will come in over budget with a net surplus of $800,000. I want to highlight a couple areas as to why. Interest income alone is likely to be $700,000 in fiscal 23. We budgeted $26,000. So that obviously is a big difference between budget versus actual, unexpected. We also have a fair amount of mandatory continuing legal education revenue coming in. As of June 30th, we were at 99% of revenue. So we still have 3 more months of pretty consistent revenue coming in there. We are, however, going to be running under in our license fee revenue, about $150,000 under. We kind of talked about that a little bit at the last meeting too. So just a lot of different areas, ups and downs, but overall we'll have excess revenue, savings as well in indirect costs. We have a number of areas that we are not going to be spending. So depreciation expense, lower professional fees for legal and audit, things like that, as well as savings in our staffing costs. We are going to have probably higher than expected budgeted costs for temporary employees, but for our regular salaries, we will have savings there. So that is our estimate as of right now. And so you can see not just the unrestricted reserve column as if we hit budget, right? So the worst case scenario, we talk about this all the time, sky is falling kind of number, but that is the number if we were to hit budget. More realistically, we budget very conservatively, and we do have variance each year. And so if you look to the column to the far right, unrestricted reserves, with $600,000 difference, which is just added to the total. That's when you see that the reserves for unrestricted is sufficient to support us through the budgeted spend downs in 2024, 25, and even into 2026. Are there any questions about these projections? Okay. Sorry.
The $600,000 bump
Mhm.
is attributed to higher interest rates.
600,000 in unrestricted reserve column. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes, you have the
Yeah.
last two columns show.
That is just assuming that we beat our budget by $600,000 each year. So it's the swing. So we just say, okay, if we hit budget,
I
versus
understand.
if we,
Thank you.
Yep.
So it's just a swag.
Yep. Mhm. Okay. All right. So the budget is going in front of the board next month, but Budget Not is actually meeting next Friday, and they will see the final budget at that point in time. I did want to mention that we also included in the confidential materials a version of the budget and a memo that outlines some details about what the budget and projections would look like if we were to renegotiate our lease. And so our broker is on the line, so if there's questions, general questions, I want to say, the specifics, of course, are confidential. The assumptions that we've made about the timeline and the rates and all of those things are there. That was one of the takeaways from the last board meeting. I think it's appropriate to say that what it reflects is that obviously it's clear by downsizing our space and having less square footage, it's going to equate to less expenses, right? So our budget each year will be lower. That means our unrestricted reserve use of unrestricted reserves will not be as much, and it can carry us forward further into the future. So that's just sort of the summary of those materials. I'm happy to answer any general questions that we can. And I know Adam Chapman is on the line as well if you have questions about the real estate market, what's happening with subleasing, all of that. And Governor Williams-Ruth, I see your hand up too.
So I get generally speaking, regarding the real estate market, because I've been following it very closely, and the most recent thing I saw was that the Smith Tower was just put back on the market, and after it being bought by someone 2 years ago, and that it's all because of the reduction in demand for commercial space. So can we get to the extent of a non-privileged discussion about where we think, at what point are we going to start seeing property owners and landlords dropping their price per square foot? Because eventually, I mean, these buildings can't sit empty. Somebody has a mortgage note on them. Somebody's going to need to make money. And I'm presuming that at some point, they're going to start trying to incentivize people to lease by dropping the price per square foot. So I would love to learn more about that in a general sense.
Adam, are you available to come on?
Yeah, I'm on, if you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, to answer your question, we're already there in the sense that landlords are doing their darndest to keep tenants to maintain their buildings, and you're right, to pay their mortgages. Where we first see the tenant-friendly aspect to the market is the huge increase in concessions. Concessions meaning free rent, tenant improvement allowances, move incentives, et cetera. Landlords are also trying their hardest to maintain what we call a face rate, so the starting rent in a new lease. And so they'll buy down the price of the lease with the concessions in order to maintain those face rates. The face rates, however, have actually gone down. And I anticipate that will continue. And then just like for your situation, landlords are getting very creative in how they approach existing tenants who for the most part are wanting to downsize, just like WISBA. So in this situation, we've had conversations pertaining to an early downsize, which would obviously help your budget, and that right sizing the University of Washington, which is your landlord, has seemed amenable to.
I just wanted to add in terms of this conversation. So obviously we don't want to talk too much about our negotiation strategy in a public meeting. And so we didn't plan to do that today, but the materials are there for you to look at. And in our September meeting, we are planning to have an executive session where we can talk about this in more detail and hopefully make a decision about how we want to move forward.
All right. Are there any further questions about the budget? Or then if not, we can move on to license fees. Oh, we're good. Okay. All right, I'm actually going to come back to this slide because it is also in the materials of the license fee memo, which is on page 367, I believe, of the materials. So the Board of Governors establishes the fee and the Supreme Court reviews it and for reasonableness. And since 2012, we have been on an annual cadence of reviewing the fee and making recommendations. And before that, it has been a variety of different cadences and structures. As we just looked at the fiscal 2024 budget, this is the 2025 license fee. So I just want to point that out. We're not matched up, and that is because we want to make sure we have time built into the process in case there is need to enact the referendum process. So that is why there's such a big difference, about a year and 4 months between when the fee is set and when it would be enacted. One of the things we did when looking at making a recommendation regarding license fees is that annual cadence. Does it make sense that we continue with an annual fee, or do we want to move forward with something like a multi-year setting fee? Right now, with a lot of decisions that still need to be made and just a lot of items in the pipeline that might have fiscal impact coming down the line, it doesn't make sense to recommend anything other than an annual fee. Perhaps in the future, when there's more certainty around certain items, you could consider a multi-year fee. But right now, I think it makes most sense for it to be annual. A couple of the other things we considered, we just talked about the unrestricted reserves. We looked at the balance, right? So coming in fiscal 23, ending the year with a positive, we've built reserves over the past few years at quite a large rate. So it's appropriate that we spend down those reserves in order to support our operating costs. But in the memo, it does reflect years where we didn't have any unrestricted reserves, right? We did use them in order to support us in times where we had the referendum in 2014 and 15. And so it has not always been that we've had reserves. We've been able to build those up over the past few years. Between fiscal 2020 and 2022, specifically, the impact of COVID on our finances did allow us to, continue to build those reserves. So that being the case, it seemed prudent and appropriate that not only would the fees or the unrestricted reserves that are available right now, as well as where we think we'll end up for this year and covers 2024's fees, which have already been approved, but they'll also cover 2025. And so we're recommending that the fees remain the same in 2025. Also, this chart does reflect that, if we do hit that variance of 600,000 or more in any given year going forward, it could stay the same into 2026 as well. So I think it's important to note there's reasons every year why we are off from budget. It changes every year. It's not necessarily the same. There's a lot of things that we are keeping an eye on. We talked about this at the last meeting, but the demographics of our membership are changing. It's something that we need to make sure that we can plan for, we can adjust to. But right now, our finances are very healthy. We have a very good reserve balance to be able to move into 2025, knowing what we know and keeping the fee the same. Alec?
So I know that we've covered this in some way, but when I look at this chart, I think what would be helpful is in the years that we show the actuals with the net income, if there's a way to also show what the budget indicated in that year, because I asked that question, including then what did we assume or when we budgeted, because there's always this discussion about deficit budgeting, and then there are those of us who say, yeah, but in the end you didn't have a deficit, you actually had a surplus. Just to put in context, so for example, if our projection right now is that we're going to have at the end of this fiscal year and $800,000 net income compared to what in our budget, because I mean, that at least helps us to put even then the FY 24, 25, and 26 in some context. And I think that would just be helpful in terms of the discussion. So.
Sure. We do have that in, I didn't put it in the slide, but it is referenced in the table in the memo on page 367 for each of the years going back. But it is helpful to know what the swing is, right, between what we budget and what we actually are coming in at. And that helps sort of support that last column on the right, that 600,000. Is that reasonable? Does it need to change? And it is also helpful to know not just that it's not that we haven't had any losses. We've had losses. We just haven't had as big of losses as we thought, right? So just really telling the full story.
And I guess, thank you. And I guess the other thing is, and I think we'll get into this probably in the September meeting, but because this column shows unrestricted reserves, and I think there's going to be a discussion regarding one restricted reserve area that I think the Board of Governors is going to have to make a decision about, which is the facilities reserve that were driven with the assumption of putting away enough to make a down payment if we were to have a building. I mean, this to me greatly changes what we're looking at in terms of FY 24 in terms of the unrestricted reserves, according to what decisions we make, hopefully in September.
Correct. So there is $2.7 million in the facilities reserve that is not part of these unrestricted reserves. And there's $2 million in operating reserve, which is your rainy day fund. So there are also two other unfunded reserves, the license fee stability fund and special projects fund, neither of which have a balance in them. So those are all of the general fund reserves available. This slide really does just assume that all of the unrestricted reserves are available to support these spend downs, that none of that is going to be allocated to any of these other reserves for any other purpose at this time. So if for some reason you wanted to add money to the facilities reserve, that would take away from what's available in the unrestricted reserves here.
And I guess one of the other things that we haven't done, I think in the last 2 years, but maybe will be something that the next board will be looking at, according to what we do regarding our space, what was being discussed, and what the delta is between what we're paying now annually for rent and what we would pay. I would imagine, I don't know for sure, but I would imagine, or at least there would be some discussion about whether you do a budget recast,
right,
according to when that comes
Correct.
in, because that's going to be a big difference in terms of the assumptions you made in building the budget, and rightfully so if you don't have that deal done. But once the deal is done, that changes, I would argue, for the better in terms of how much our expenses are.
Yeah, and that's what the materials do provide, is just a glimpse at what the budget would look like if we were to execute some sort of renegotiation and how that would impact the 24 budget. So you'd be able to see ideally what that reforecast would be. Again, there's a lot of unknowns and assumptions built in there and timing, but has obviously a lesser impact in fiscal 24. It would reduce expenses a little bit, but obviously a much larger impact in 2025 and 26. Yeah, Governor Keating.
Yeah, I just have a question about expenses.
Mhm.
It seems to me there's a rather rapid rise in expenses from 2023 to 2026. Is that just a hold? I mean, it's $4 million seems fairly significant. It's about, I'm not great at math, 20% increase in 3 years.
Yeah, so a couple different things there. One is that the 2023 numbers are what we project, and that is essentially actuals, right? And there are a lot of line items that we aren't necessarily spending on. And the 24 budget likely is built on the 23 budget. and not necessarily the actuals. And that's because there are some items where actuals are, it's what's happening right now, but it doesn't mean that they don't need those funds next year. So the budget is still appropriate. It's just that they did not spend it this year. So I will say that that's kind of that inflating factor, is that the 23, you can't just take the actuals for 23 and add a percentage increase for 24. It's a combination of knowing that we had a budget, that's still the appropriate budget or not. But that's why there's a bump up. If you were to look at our budgeted expenses versus where we budget for 24, there probably is a lesser increase.
One other historical question I have, and that is because, and you mentioned it in terms of after the referendum, the use of reserves. Do we also have, after the referendum, had we not done that, what our FTE count or what would have happened? Because it seems to me after the referendum, there could have been an approach of doing significant cuts to balance the budget. But a decision that was made was, let us use the reserves at least for a period of time to offset having to make those significant cuts. Am I correct?
Yeah, I do. My, again, recollection is that we did have to make cuts. It's not that we didn't, we absolutely did. And you can see that just in the FTE count alone in those years. But we were able to maintain probably a more stable operation than having to make drastic cuts if those reserves weren't available. I also will mention that at that time, we also renegotiated our lease in order to stay in the existing space, and we're able to reallocate facilities reserve funds into our unrestricted reserves to be able to spend that down for operations.
And if my memory serves me, that's also when we had a conference center
Yes,
someplace else. And so we had
correct.
two facilities and we
Consolidated.
closed down that one and then did tenant improvements on the conference center that we have now in our headquarters.
And also shrunk our footprint slightly as well. So there was a lot of things happening in that, say, 3-year time frame that equated to being able to have the available funds to spend down and continue operations. But I do think to some degree we're sort of at that stage again, right, where we are looking at our facilities reserve, we're looking at what the plan is and what our available funds are to continue going forward with the fees as well. So. Other questions? No. Right.
Tiffany, it's been said before, but say it again, appreciate you and the hard work that you do.
Thank you. Right.
All right, President Clark is granting us a 15-minute break. So be back in whatever 2:38 plus 15 minutes is.
2:45, let's see.
Okay, 2:45, we're saying.
Switch up.
See,
Yeah.
it's hard to do math on the
Exactly.
fly. 2:55.